Everyone, and thank you to the invitation today to speak about our perspective on a resilient food system. I will try to change. Okay. I do it by hand. So basically, as you said, I'm in charge of sustainability and innovation at Avril Group. And maybe I want to introduce briefly what is Avril, because I believe that you will see that it is interesting for the audience to understand that industry can play a role towards more resilient food system. Avril is an industrial group rooted in the agriculture world, because our raw material is rapeseed and sunflower essentially. And we are focusing on delivering on 4 priority markets. Specialty ingredients, that means we develop different ingredients out of those different oil or proteins for specialty markets. We develop goods for the consumer goods market, from vegetable table oils to different food and also soap and different sauce and condiments. We are in the renewable fuel market. That means in the energy sector, we transform certain vegetable oils into biodiesel. And we might speak about it. And finally, also we use the co-products of the oil, per se, the proteins, to make feed for animal farming. Interestingly enough, Avril was created during the embargo on soy that occurred many years ago, when the US decided to reduce the exportation of soy to Europe. Europe have always been dependent on the American continent on soy, and soy, as you probably know, is very important for animal farming. And at the time where the embargo was done, it was a crisis that everyone forgot. In 1973, the soy embargo, but it was the first time where we, I would say, touch this issue of food resilience. And the farmers in France at the time said, okay, we need to develop more local solutions for animal farming. And they had, as an issue, a lack of equity to engage into projects. And so they ask actually the government to put a voluntary tax on what they produce, to create a fund over 10 years, about 170 million euro that were, I would say, collected to have equity to be invested into the agri-food value chain and being able to develop the rapeseed production in France, particularly, and the sunflower production. And Avril was created at the time under the name of Sophie Proteol, and we only at the beginning invested in projects created by farmers. And then later, some of our participation became majority participation, and now we are a group of about 7 billion euro operating in several countries in the world. 60% of our turnover is still coming from France, but actually we've made a lot of different acquisitions, and we've been growing in the last few years. And interestingly enough, one of the basic principles of our founders was that all the profits made by the company would be reinvested in the value chain. So we don't distribute any dividends. We just reinvest in the entire value chain, whether and we have still, that's why I believe we are an original group. We have a financial arm where we invest in minority projects with other partners, and we have the industrial branch, which is this 7 billion euro company, where we continue to develop and to grow with the basic principles that were the basic principle of our funders. But we are an industrial group and we are not a COP. Maybe just to see what we do, how it works, we start and I would say we don't do breeding for seeds ourselves, but we invest in breeding companies. We are, I would say, taking rapeseed and sunflower. Basically, we are the downstream of more than 100,000 farmers, so it's significant. We start by crushing the seeds. We don't collect them. There are other players that are collecting the seeds. We crush the different seeds. We produce oilseed meal, rich in protein, and we produce oil. And the oil and the proteins are going in through 4 markets that I mentioned previously: animal nutrition, human food, renewable chemistry, and renewable energy. And we strongly believe that it's very important that we address in parallel all these different markets. And I think in this diagram, it's very easy to understand. When you start with these oil seeds, when you crush them, you produce together protein and oil. And these 2 outlets needs to be balanced. Other economically, it doesn't work. So what is resilience? Coming back to our purpose today. It's the ability to continue operating while we absorb the shocks and the perturbation. And we believe that today, with last 20 years of more, or 50 years of focusing on productivity, focusing on full optimization, focusing on cost, we have built fully optimized system on the sole criteria of profits and productivity. But these very, very efficient systems are extremely, extremely fragile and not sustainable because they are linked to very complex system, and any little pebble in the system, little rocks, can disrupt the entire system. And that's what we observe today in this crisis. How to become more resilient? First, to better control the supply and to manage the supply chain risk. Supply chain is critical in this entire system, from the raw material of agriculture to the product of agriculture themselves. To have a more balanced portfolio of activity with a diversified upstream and downstream, while focusing on productivity, really created a system relying on very few crops and very few producers, develop more sustainably, and realize that this very optimized system, which works beautifully in normal time, have a lot of hidden connections in the system. And those little hidden connections are actually the fragility of the system. So what are the shocks that we are facing? I think it's good to just remember ourselves about these different sources of shocks. It goes from the evolution of climate change. We have a food system which is much more sensitive to drought, to storm, to flooding, and to global warming. We have over-specialized at all scales the productions, at the country level, at the farm level, at the supply chain. We have also encouraged certain regulations. And finally, that's creating a lot of fragility to the system, just because if you have a drought, for instance, in one country, if it's over-specialized, you lose the production in that country. If in the supply chain, there are an event that could disrupt the supply chain, you impact the entire system of this system. The concentration of supply sources is always also very, I would say, important to understand. We've seen, for instance, the Ukraine war impact on sunflower. People started to realize that the open market for sunflower seeds, 50% was coming in the world from Ukraine. It's a huge dependency. And if you add Russia, it's even more than that. Take maybe a very small example, but I think it's amazing. You know, French mustard. In France, people love kind of mustard named Dijon mustard, created from a region in France near Dijon. And over the years, all the crops have been coming from Canada. And last year, they had a drought and the production plummeted. Go in the shops in France, since now 6 months, you can't find any mustard. Just because, as a matter of fact, it was cheaper to buy the Canadian seeds of mustard, and actually out of the needs of mustard seeds for the French market, we only finally produced in France 5% of the total needs. Obviously, it needs to be corrected. And the energy and fertilizer network, I would say, connection, we are seeing today a huge increase of energy price, but remember that gas is also very important for fertilizers. You can't do nitrogen fertilizers without energy. In the last few months, fertilizer prices have been tripled, and looking at fertilizers, what a dependency. Phosphates, we have only two huge countries supplying phosphates, Morocco and United States, and China, sorry. For potassium, the main importer of potassium source is Russia. And for nitrogen, I already mentioned, not only the impact of energy on the fertilizers, making fertilizers production extremely costly today, but on top of it, most of the fertilizers have been coming from Russia for Europe in the last few years. We are totally dependent on other countries, and we have developed that thanks to over-optimization. And finally, also, optimization is also putting a pressure on biodiversity, but also on the quality of food, less taste, and also less consumer appeal. Let's take one example. I think it's very interesting, is the protein dependence on Europe on proteins. 70% of the European proteins are imported. Just because most of the protein that we need for food, actually through feed, because the protein, the vegetable proteins are then transformed in meat, and 75% of those soy is imported, and these proteins are imported. France, thanks to, I would say, the creation of Avril and other policies, we are depending only at 50%. So it's better, but it's still 50%. And actually, when you want to develop the protein business, actually, let's take the example of the rapeseed story. It's a success story in France and in Europe, because in the last 20 or 30 years, we've developed that crop that originally did not exist, and is creating a source for protein for animal farming. What I mentioned at the beginning, that when you crush the seeds, you do oil and you do protein. You want to have more proteins. So if you want to have more proteins, you will have more oil. And interestingly enough, is 25% of the rapeseed oil goes to the food market. So what the hell do you do with the remaining part of the oil? Actually, one of the very important markets and outlet for the oil is biofuel. So you have, interestingly, a very strong dependency of agriculture. I mentioned energy, gas price on fertilizers and other food production. But also there is a second dependency, which is the fact that if we can't sell and utilize the oil to produce biofuels, then you cannot grow the crops to make proteins, because you need only 25% of the oil produced by the seeds for the food market. The rest needs to be utilized, otherwise you don't balance the two markets. So that's why a group like Havril, where we try to develop the different markets together, we believe it's very important for agriculture. And for instance, I'm taking the example of innovation that we try to do. For instance, utilizing proteins to make and other vegetable product to replace chemicals in wood panel that are being produced without chemicals, to develop food for humans directly out of vegetable proteins, to decrease the need of protein for animal feed, but also replacing soy and importing soy, which is responsible for deforestation, by local, more sustainable crops for fish farming. Finally, I want to conclude on three call for actions. One being local, by developing more local agricultural sectors, creating strong links from farms to the final usage, exactly what was done on rapeseed and sunflower over the last 30 years. To take into account that we need to create more values for the crops, to give positive incentive for farmers to develop those crops in the food, in the feed, but in other sectors, to balance the risk and increase the value and the overall value of the crops, having balanced outlet, and redistribute the value to new generation of farmers. Because one other issue that for resilience and sustainability we will face in the future is that a lot of farmers are retiring, and they are not being replaced. They are not being replaced because we don't offer to the farmers a decent living. And we need to have more educated consumers being ready to pay for the services that are provided by agriculture, beyond the fact that agriculture is providing food. Thank you very much.